Hello and welcome to Nano Talks. I am Fabio Polizzi. I am the Chief Editor of Nature Nanotechnology, and I am very pleased today to have here talking to me Dr. Timothy Duncan from the US Food and Drug Administration. Hello, Tim.
Hi, how are you?
Hi. And Tim, it's been working for many years on nanomaterials, nanotechnology, and among the various interests that he has, he is interested in nanosensors applied in food, and he's recently written a review article for Nature Nanotechnology, and we just want to explore a little bit more his feelings about this topic. So first of all, can you just explain us how would nanosensors work? What type of nanosensor you see published around and investigated?
Sure. So I guess it'd be best to start by defining what a nanosensor is. And a nanosensor is some sort of device or system that allows you to detect some substance or change in environmental conditions. And the nano part is obviously one or more of those components is going to be on the nanoscale. And so that nanoscale component can be the part that either captures whatever the substance is or recognizes it, or it can be the one that has the signal, or it can be something that amplifies the signal. There's a lot of different ways that the nano component can be integrated into it. For foods, usually the nanosensor would be intended to either improve the safety of the food or the quality of the food. And so the types of things that you could use these to sense range from like small molecules or metal ions, all the way up to proteins, DNA fragments, or even entire microorganisms. So there's a whole range of these systems. It's an incredibly broad area. So when we set about trying to get a bird's eye view of the field, we separated them into what we call in the paper 3 classes. We call them class 1, class 2, and class 3. So class 1 are devices that would be, or systems that would be intended to be used in a laboratory, either replacing or complementing like conventional analysis methods. So these, an example would be some of the work that we've done. So we've been interested in developing a nanosensor for botulinum neurotoxin, which is the causative agent of foodborne botulism. And so the way it would work is you have like a nanoparticle, a fluorescent particle that you put on the surface, something that recognizes the toxin, and if the toxin is present, the fluorescence properties change, which you can measure in the laboratory using a fluorimeter, for instance. So that would be something we would consider a class 1 sensor. A class 2 sensor, rather than bringing the samples into the lab, these are intended to bring the lab basically to the sample. So these are like usually self-contained devices, either based on paper strips, like a pregnancy test would be like a paper strip-based device, or a electrochemical sensor, or a microfluidic sensor that you could then take into the field and screen large numbers of samples very rapidly. Recently, there's been a real interest in interfacing these with like smartphones. So because everybody carries around a computer with them these days, you can use that smartphone as both the data recording device, but also actually your scientific instrument. So if your sensor uses fluorescence or color change, you have a camera on your phone, you can actually photograph it and measure the color change and then record the data. So I think this is a really exciting area for food nanosensing. The third and final class is we call class 3. Whereas class 2 sensors are meant to measure your sample at a single point in time, class 3 sensors are really built for real-time monitoring of sample conditions. So I can give you 2 examples in the food area. One would be like an indicator that you could put inside of a food package to detect or monitor for the presence of oxygen or changes in temperature, something that a consumer could look at on a package and tell really quickly that the package is either unsafe or maybe not at its peak quality. Another area where there's a real interest in this is in agricultural uses. So there's been some work on putting like a little electrochemical chips onto like the surface of leaves that would monitor for like stress hormones in the leaf. And so a farmer could tell really quickly whether his plants are water stressed or something like that. So that gives you sort of an idea of the breadth of the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's actually quite diverse. But would you say that is there any particular sensor or any class of sensor that you feel like that is more advanced towards being actually used? And but also, what are instead, if not, or if it's not completely there, what are the technological challenges still to be addressed?
I think looking at the field as a whole, I think every class has its advantages and disadvantages. But I think if you look at it, particularly from the ability that something to bring something really new to the table, I think really these class two sensors, which are the ones that are intended to be able to take into the field for rapid screening of samples. I think they are probably, and in fact, we suggest at the end of the paper that they might be the best place to prioritize attention because, well, there's two reasons. One is because they would be intended for rapid screening of samples. Really, the most important factor from a development standpoint is not having or ensuring that there's a low false negative rate, right? Because if you're going to screen samples, you just don't want to miss any. Because these are going to then be probably taken back into the laboratory and then measured using a more conventional technique, there's that fail-safe. So there's less of a risk in developing them, and validation maybe is a little bit easier. They also they also meet an unmet need. If you look at food analysis now, we have really good tools to do it. LC-MS and ICP-MS are kind of the workhorses of food analysis from a chemical standpoint, and there are equivalent microbiological methods that do a really good job. They're reliable, really sensitive, and so there's not really a huge need to replace them. There are always areas for improvement, but they do well. What we can't do now is you can't take an LC-MS into the field and measure samples. It's just not possible. So there's really nothing that we have that can do that. And so I think that the class 2 sensors really give you something new. And so that's why I would really strongly advocate for their further development. As far as technical challenges, of course, they all have lots of technical challenges. That's the kind of part of the point of the article. And when we refer to technical challenges in the article, we aren't really necessarily focused on those that would be encountered during the development of the proof of concept, which is where most of the technology is right now. We're really more interested in technical challenges that would occur after the proof of concept stage through to the final implementation stage. And there's really two, I think, of those that are the most problematic, and those are scale up and real world use. So scale up is like being able to, when you create a proof of concept prototype, right, you do these in the laboratory and you're making your nanomaterial on a scale of a milligram, right? And so we're really good at that. Where we really need more knowledge is being able to scale up those syntheses, nanomaterial syntheses to kilogram scale, which you would need if you wanted to implement these on a broad scale. And it's more of a chemical engineering problem than a laboratory chemistry problem. And so I don't think that field is as mature, and being able to ensure that if you scale these up, that you get the same size ranges that you want and impurities and things of that nature. As far as real world use, this has to do with things like, if you have this sensor and if your sensor is designed to detect something in kumquats, for instance, I don't know why you would do kumquats, but in the laboratory, you might do one batch of these, but if you're going to implement them in the field, you need to do, from thousands of grocery stores, right? What kind of variation do you have? If you have 100 people using this, do you have variation like that? So that's what I mean by real use. We need like a broad assessment of the utility of these, and that's a real technical challenge.
Well, it's interesting also that you mentioned the scaling up, because that seems to be also a common theme with nanotechnology in general. I mean, in every field you have this issue. But going back to challenges, though, in your review, you also talk a lot about other types of challenges, not necessarily the technological one. And in fact, we reading between the lines, one could even think that those are the real challenges. That one of the reasons why perhaps things are not going as fast as they could go, or so on. So you're talking about, regulatory challenges and other types like that. Would you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so when we started this project, the motivation for it was that being interested in this area, we see hundreds of publications of food nanosensors every year. It's still a relatively small fraction of the total number of nanosensor papers in all fields, but food, the fraction interested in food is actually growing. What we're seeing is actual products implemented in the field, and so there was a disconnect there that we wanted to explore. The technical challenges were pretty self-evident to us, but it turned out that there's actually quite a few, as you said, non-technical challenges, and in some sense these are going to be harder to solve because you can't use a scientific approach to solve them by definition. So we came up with 7 categories of challenges in this paper, one of which was the technical, and the other 6 were non-technical. So we looked at each one of these in pretty good level of detail. So we have things like the regulatory challenges, as you mentioned. So these would be challenges related to, well, there's compliance, right? So if you were going to put these into any kind of product, there would be likely to be different types of regulations that you would need to comply to. So if you're going to put it into a food package, there might be food packaging regulations. If you're going to, there might be environmental regulations. So the end of life cycle of these, what happens after you recycle them, and so on and so forth. There's also validation. So there's technical aspects of validation, but there's also the fact that if a public health agency is going to use these, there's a lot of rules that need to be followed in order to ensure that they are that they meet certain criteria as far as their reliability, for instance. So those are regulatory challenges. We also have economic challenges, which is, again, kind of endemic to the nanotechnology field. The nanomaterials still are fairly expensive to manufacture. For nanosensors, if the nanomaterial is going to be the part that does all the work, we're going to need to make sure they're high quality nanomaterials. So that's expensive, particularly in the food area. Food products are not very tolerant of expensive new technologies because the margins tend to be pretty low. It's going to be a real challenge to implement those in commercial food products, I think. There's also intellectual property issues, which are expensive, of course, but also in nanotechnology, it's kind of a little bit of a wild west in some sense for patents. And so that needs to be worked out. There's also environmental health and safety challenges. We look at those, which are fairly self-evident as to what those are, but not necessarily straightforward to solve. We look at legal challenges. So if these would be used in a regulatory sense, that it's any of that data could always end up in a court someday, and so there are rules governing whether those would meet evidentiary standards. We also look at some of the political challenges, which are things like inter-organizational disputes as to how do you standardize the procedures and things of that nature. And then finally, the last one we look at are ethical challenges. And this one was pretty interesting because at least when we set about this, thought that these are nanosensors, they're for food safety. Why would there be any ethical challenges associated with the development of food nanosensors? In fact, there are quite a few that you could think of, and they're very difficult. They could be very difficult to solve. So one of those would be like the equitability of the distribution of these technologies. How do you distribute them fairly so that less advantaged countries or people could take advantage of them? And there's also a lot of data security and trust issues. So what if a company wanted to put one of these class 3 nanosensors and track that could wirelessly transmit data, could they use that? Would they have the right to use that to track consumer spending habits and things of that nature? So there's a lot of sticky issues, I think, that would need to be looked at in order to responsibly develop these.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, once again, I find it very interesting that you mentioned these ethical issues, because if they are, again, if every time we talk about, for example, nanomedicine and its impact on potentially on global health, that is one of the big problems. I mean, it's the fact that would we be able to deploy this, or would they be able to employ it in less advantaged or less rich countries where they can't simply afford either producing them or even buying them? Okay, so in total, I think there's quite still a lot of things to solve. But let's say, are you optimistic that we will eventually come to use these nanosensors in food? Or
I'm optimistic. As you said, I think first of all, I think it's definitely worth pursuing them. For one thing, there's a lot of basic science still to be learned that could be applied to other areas. There's also as I mentioned, the fact that they meet some unmet needs. They're just some things that you kind of, it's hard to envision being able to do without this device miniaturization that's enabled by nanotechnology. You can't miniaturize an LCMS and bring it into the field, right? So the advantages, I think that if we're proactive about solving some of these challenges, I think that there's a real possibility that we could get to where we want to be. At the end of the article, we do provide a few high-level recommendations or suggestions as to how we think that we could help the process along. So things like, if you look at like the publications and the work that's going into it, 99% of it at least is probably on the basic science side. We could use more research into these more tech transfer issues. So things like validation studies and not only the natural sciences, but also some of the social science aspects, and researching this and finding out what people think. So giving money or funding that kind of work, I think, would be very important, and also finding publication venues for it. We recommend in there to prioritize the class 2 sensor research because we think that stands the highest chance, at least in the short term, of finding successful implementation. And the final thing is that we recommend is some of these issues related to adaptability, being able to come up with platforms that are more likely to be economically viable or are able to be implemented on a broad scale. I think if those kind of things, and cost obviously, if those kind of things can be incorporated early on in the design, even before the proof of concept stage, you know, when people are writing proposals to get these things funded, if we can think more proactively about some of these issues that are going to be faced down the road, I think we're more likely to have successful proposals that have a high chance of being translated in the future into successful technologies.
Okay. All right. Well, I'd like to thank you again, Tim, for talking to us. Thank you for your contribution in terms of the review article, I mean, but also thank you for talking to us today and explaining it in first person what you feel about it. And well, good luck with your work, and see you soon.
Thank you.